Hello everyone, how are you? Today I'm gonna show you how I created this 3D animation in Blender. Since I love making 2D looking 3D renders, I took an illustration whose look I liked and I simply tried to recreate it in 3D while also using some 3D specific tools to make it come alive, and now I'm gonna show you my process. Before anything else, I organized my project and I divided it into several stages. First, matching the illustration, which was the whole reason I chose this reference, to get a 2D look in a 3D software. This included modeling all the elements, creating the outline, the shaders and the details in grease pencil. At this stage, I ignored the lighting since it was something a bit more complicated that I addressed later. The second part of my project was gonna cover making the image come to life to get the most out of the 3D software I was using. Here I decided that it was gonna be a loop animation, which meant the first and last keyframes had to match. I decided I was gonna animate all the objects I'd created. The lily pads were gonna have a swing motion, the frog was gonna breathe, the clover was gonna move, and the arms and legs were gonna move as well. I also wanted to animate the cowsticks, and this was not a walk in the park. That's why I made a separate in-depth tutorial for this effect. And at this stage I recreated the lighting, animated the light beams and made a double light effect. After finishing all this, I decided I wanted to create some objects that weren't originally in the reference. Some fishes swimming around and a couple of dragonflies made sense for this pond scene. This of course meant modeling, animating, and shading every one of these elements in a similar style to my reference. And lastly, I decided to make a day-to-night effect, and again, since this was gonna be a loop animation, I also had to create a night-to-day scene so the ending matched the beginning of the animation seamlessly. And of course, the night needed some elements as well, so I made some moths and created some fireflies. And after all that work, I had to render everything, and I did the compositing and the sound design in DaVinci Resolve, a free editing software. Okay, now let's start from the beginning. For the modeling, I started up by importing the reference image into Blender, and in case you didn't know, if you choose your view first and then import your image, it will get placed along that specific axis. I worked in top view to match my reference, and to avoid modeling a massively big scene, after adding a subdivision modifier to my cube, I scaled it down a bit and I scaled my reference image to match this sphere. I placed my camera at the very beginning so I could work in camera view right from the start, to avoid having to move things around later on and to work on the final composition while modeling the objects. And then I just started adding cubes with a subdivision modifier to create every shape. I had to do some minor adjustments according to the body part I was modeling. So for the arms, I had to move some vertices to match the illustration, and I also added a loop cut at the bottom. Having a reference and working in X-ray mode makes things look simpler, since we just have to decompose the image into geometric shapes. I added another cube with a subdivision modifier for the eyes, and for the legs I also had to make some changes to the geometry, just like I did for the arms, and as you can see, it's all simple shapes and very basic modeling techniques. During the modeling stage, I worked mostly in X-ray mode, to be able to see the reference image and to make sure I selected all the vertices. One of the reasons I chose this illustration is because the shapes are pretty simple, so I knew I wouldn't lose much time modeling complex shapes, hence I could spend most of my time on the 2D look. Even if I wasn't going to show my model from all sides, I still tried for it not to look weird from other angles. At some point I needed to move the image to the side to compare both frogs, and this forced me to make some changes to the shape as well. And once my main shapes were ready, I added a mirror modifier to all the limbs. Sometimes, even if you follow the reference to the letter, the shape of your 3D model might look a bit weird, since 2D and 3D are different mediums. I had to keep playing around with the geometry to refine my model a bit, and then I needed to place the reference behind the model again to make sure it didn't look completely different to the illustration. For the lily pads, I also started with a primitive, in this case a circle. I filled it and I inset a face to match where this V shape called notch ends. I duplicated my mesh to get all the lily pads I needed and I scaled them to match my reference. After that, it was time to create this V shape called a notch. I started by deleting this vertex. I scaled these two vertices towards their medium point. I did the same with these two vertices and then I merged these three. And all I had to do was repeat the process with all the other lily pads. I had to scale the edge loops to match where the notch was in each lily pad, and then it was the same process, scale and mesh vertices. In some cases, I also had to move some vertices around too, to match the shape perfectly. I also moved some vertices to avoid the shapes looking too perfect. At this stage, working in either camera view or in top view was important to avoid the vertices being moved in the z-axis. In some cases, I had to delete more than one vertex, and for this one, for example, I merged several vertices together. Finally, in this case, since I had two cuts with different sizes each, after finishing the first one, I had to add a few loop cuts to match my second one. And then I could delete this vertex, merge these three, and moved this one a bit. Once I had my lily pads, I checked out my work in solid mode, and I fixed the circles that looked a bit wonky. Since here I wasn't in camera view, I had to make sure I didn't move the vertices in the z-axis to avoid the model looking like this. By pressing Shift and the axis key you want to avoid, in this case the z-axis, you'll allow movement on the x and y axis only. To add some thickness, I added a solidify modifier, and to soften the edges, I added a bevel modifier. I also added a subdivision modifier and I copied the modifiers to all the other lily pads. Luckily, there's a command for that, so select the object with the modifiers at last, Ctrl L and copy modifiers. Back to my frog, I applied the subdivision modifier since I needed some more geometry, and with the help of proportional editing, I moved the bottom part of the frog so it didn't stick out from the lily pad. To flatten all these vertices, I scaled them to 0 on the z-axis. Then I moved the entire body up a bit, and I moved some vertices from the body and the legs to make sure the frog looked like it's resting on top of the lily pad. Then all that was left was to model the clover, which is probably the most complex shape of this entire scene. I started with a path to create the stem, and I needed to add some depth to make it thicker. I scaled the tip down, and for the leaves I used a plane with a subdivision modifier. And by scaling, adding some loop cuts and moving some vertices around, I was able to get a similar shape to the illustration. Since I needed two leaves, I added a mirror modifier, and since I chose the stem as my mirror object, I had to change its origin. And then I could move the leaves. I made some more changes to the model by sliding some vertices, and I added a solidify modifier to add some thickness to the leaves. And finally, I moved the vertices a bit more to make the leaves a bit curvier, just like in my reference image. Then it was time for the outline, and I decided I was going to use the inverted hull method, so I had to enable back face culling in the outline material, and I added a second solidify modifier. To create the noisy outline look, I used a noise texture node. I changed the noise texture node settings and I chose 2 shades of green. I had to move the subdivision modifier to the bottom to fix this artifact right here, and I kept playing around with my settings until I was happy with the way things were looking. And here we have the outline. And once this lily pad's outline was finished, I could simply copy both the materials and the modifiers to the other lily pads with the Ctrl-L shortcut. I ended up using different values for the outline. The big lily pads have a thicker outline than the smaller ones. Then it was time to add the outline to the frog. I started with the same material as the lily pad's outline, but I turned it into a single user copy, and I added a solidify modifier, and I also added a subdivision modifier to make the outline look smoother. Naturally, the limbs needed the same outline material, and I also needed to add a solidify modifier to each mesh. I took this moment to organize the modifiers, and I set the solidify modifier to create the legs outline before copying the modifiers to the remaining limbs. I ended up choosing a thicker outline for the legs only, and once I had all my outlines, I changed the colors in the color ramp node to lighter shades of green to match my reference. Later, I made some changes to the outline material to create a highlight effect. I'm gonna show it to you shortly. Like I mentioned before, I used a different solidify modifier value for the legs only, so this outline was a bit thicker to play with the line weight of my model a bit. And I also created an outline for the leaves, and then to add these lines right here, I needed to add some geometry, so I duplicated the legs and I deleted the solidify modifier and I decreased the subdivision modifier and I applied it to have some more geometry. I moved some edges so they follow the line of the outline. I duplicated the edges and separated them. And I deleted the duplicated leg since I didn't need it anymore. I needed the outline material only, and to create the line art, I moved the vertices, and since I used the leg to create them, the geometry was close to my model. I extruded the vertices, and for these planes, I needed to turn the material into a new copy and disabled backface culling. And I kept working on the geometry, and when I needed some more vertices, I subdivided this mesh and I kept moving some vertices with proportional editing enabled. This is the floating planes or mesh planes as outline method. I actually talked about this in a previous video. As you can see, this was pretty straightforward work. I simply looked at the illustration and tried to match it by moving the vertices while in camera view. I had to make the line art shorter so it matched my reference perfectly, and since the outline didn't look exactly like the illustration, I kept moving some edges around, and then I made some changes to the frog body shape so it matched my reference a bit better. For the lines around the arms, I followed the same process. I duplicated the belly of the frog, deleted the solidify modifier and chose the legs line art material. I added a mirror modifier and I added a couple of loop cuts since I needed some edges that followed the line of the arms. Then I selected some edges, duplicated them and separated them, and I deleted the duplicated mesh. And then I extruded the edges and I worked on my line art just like I did with the legs. And just like I said in one of my previous videos, remember that your project doesn't have to look good from every single angle, but from camera view. Even if that means deceiving the eye a little bit and bending the tools and techniques. If it looks good on camera, who cares if it's just some planes stuck to the legs and the arms of our model. What matters is the illusion of an outline in some areas, regardless of how we achieve it. And here I had to change the geometry of the arms a bit. For the leaves, I used the same shader and a solidify modifier to create the outline, and for the stem I used the same material, but I disabled backface culling since this mesh didn't need a solidify modifier to create an outline. Once most of my outline was ready, I added a green emissive material so I could see the line art a bit better. And like I said, later on I made some changes to the outline material to add some highlights. To the nodes I already had, I added another mapping node to control the position and the size of the highlights, a color ramp node, and a mix node to combine both the grain and the highlight effect. To control where the color gets darker and where it gets brighter, I added several color stops with black and white. The white leaves the color as it is, the black makes it darker, and to make the color brighter, I used white but I set the value to something greater than 1. To create the lily pads material, I used a group of nodes to create a radial gradient effect. And I used another group of nodes to create a noise effect, and I had to create a new material copy for each lily pad because each mesh had a different size, so they needed different values in this mapping node to achieve the radial gradient effect, and I repeated the process until all my lily pads had their own material. Since I thought the material looked a bit too dark, I changed the black in this color ramp node for a gray color instead, and I was done with this shader. To create the leaf veins, I selected some edges from one of the lily pads, duplicated them, and I separated them into a new mesh. I chose the same material as the outline, but this one needed backface culling disabled, and all the modifier had to go. I completed the line using the fill tool, and I extruded the edges. I placed this line right at the center of the lily pad, and I set the origin of this line at the center of the mesh. And then I created all the lines I needed by duplicating the first one. And since we set the pivot point at the center, rotating these meshes was easy. And I had to delete the edges that stuck out. Of course, I had to repeat this process for each lily pad, so they all had their correspondent leaf veins. Again, I set the 3D cursor at the center of the lily pad to make sure the meshes were right in the middle. I scaled them a bit and I had to match each mesh with the length of the lily pad. I rotated the objects to match the illustration. And finally, I had to parent these meshes to their corresponding lily pad. And after repeating the process, I had all my leaf nerds done and parented to their respective lily pads. And back to my frog, since I wanted to add some gradient to the green material, first I enabled ambient occlusion, and I added an ambient occlusion node and a color ramp with 2 shades of green. I applied the mirror modifier and I separated the arms into 2 separate objects, so I could assign a different material to each to play with their mapping values separately, since each arm needed different mapping values. I also applied the subdivision modifier to have some more geometry, and I added another one to make the model smoother. Of course, I had to repeat the process for the other arm, And then I had to do the same with the legs, since I also wanted them to have a gradient shader. I had to place the darker green, and I did the same for these spheres at the top. For the clover, I used design notes, I placed the dark green color, and for the belly, I added a plain, emissive green shader, and my front material was done. To create the details such as the face and the highlights, I added a grease pencil object. I set the stroke placement to surface, so the strokes get drawn close to my mesh, and I drew in camera view. I set the X-ray slider to a value that allowed me to see both my reference and the strokes. To create the mouth, I created a stroke material and I used the arc tool. And before clicking to confirm, I used the manipulators to get a shape that is closer to my reference. I drew the eyes in a new layer so I could add a mirror modifier to that layer only, and that way I didn't need to draw both eyes. For the cheeks, I changed to a fill material and I used the circle tool and I added another mirror modifier. Since the cheeks were too close to my model, I had to move them in edit mode just a bit. I also placed the eyes and the mouth a bit higher and I polished the shape of the mouth a bit with the graph brush in a sculpt mode. After spending some time with that, I also added a smooth modifier to make the lines a bit more fluid. I thought the mouth needed to be a bit thinner, but instead of drawing it again, I used the normalize thickness tool. Then I drew this highlight using the draw tool. As you can see, each face stroke was drawn in a different layer, and for the frog highlight, I lowered the material's alpha value to match the look of the illustration. To create the lily pads highlight, I needed a new grease pencil object, you'll see why in a minute. I sampled the color and I also drew in surface mode using the draw tool. Pressing shift while using the draw tool helps to get smoother lines. And I parented this grease pencil object to the lily pad so they move along. Then I added another grease pencil object to draw another highlight, and I parented to this big lily pad. And in this case I changed the opacity of this layer instead of the material's alpha value, so I could choose different values for each highlight. After having most of my 2D look done, I wanted to make this scene come to life. To animate the lily pads, I started by adding an empty for each lily pad, and I parented each empty to each object. My idea was to create a tranquil pond, so I decided the movements needed to be slow, and to achieve that, I created a slow-paced animation by moving the X and the Y axis, and I duplicated the first keyframe and took it to the end to create a loop. Then I moved only one of the axis keyframes to break the movement a bit, and I spaced the keyframes so the animation was even slower. And I played around with the interpolation. Here is where I decided how many frames my animation was gonna last, and I had to move the keyframes again so the motion lasts the entire timeline, and I spaced the keyframes a bit more to make the motion even slower. As you can see, we have a rocking or swaying movement that goes to the right and then comes back to the left. I ended up animating the rotation as well, so the movement feels a bit more natural. Then I repeated the process to animate all the other lily pads. And as you can see, some objects move to the left first and others to the right, so the animation feels a bit more natural. And I had to parent the grease pencil objects to the empties so they move along as well. Afterwards, I had to parent the frog to the empty that was animating the lily pad, where the frog was sitting to make sure they moved together. To make the frog move, I needed an armature, so I started with a bone, and after placing it in edit mode, while still in edit mode, I pressed Shift A to add a separate bone. And by pressing L, you can select one bone only to place it in edit mode without moving the other. Then I named the bone, and this step is important, you will see why in a second. And the name you pick also matters. As you can see, I used a standard suffix, in this case _L for left side bones. And then I added a third bone, and I had to name this bone as well by following the convention I just told you about. Now, since I named the bones this way, I can simply select the bones, right click and symmetrize. And now I have all the bones I needed. Then I had to parent all the frog limbs, the meshes used to create the arm and the leg outline, and the grease pencil object to the armature. I chose parent with automatic weights. Remember to always move the armature modifier to the top of the list, and I did the same for every single parented object. And now the frog wasn't moving along with the lily pad anymore, and that's because now I had to parent the armature to the empty that was animating the lily pad where the frog was sitting to make sure they moved together. At first sight, everything seemed correctly parented, but the ultimate test is moving each bone in pose mode. Roughly, it looked okay except for the grease pencil object. The weight of the mouth and the highlight were fine, but the eyes and the cheeks weren't moving along with the armature. But since the eyes and the cheeks had a mirror modifier, I had to apply the mirror modifiers first, and before going to weight paint mode, I rotated some strokes in edit mode and I flattened and smoothed some points in a sculpt mode. I made sure the eyes were close to the mesh, and then I was ready to set this grease pencil object's weight paint. I simply had to pick each bone and assign the weight for each stroke. This was a trial and error process. It wasn't as straightforward as it looks in this video, because I will set the weight, then I will test it in pose mode, and come back to weight paint to change it. I even animated the model, changed the weight again, until I liked the result. Once I had my armature, I could start animating the frog. First, I wanted to create a breathing motion, and to achieve that, I animated the scale. I set a scale keyframe, then a couple of frames forward I scaled it up, set a keyframe, and I duplicated the first one to get a loop animation. Here we have the overall effect, but since I wanted the head to move less, I decided to change the weight paint of the spheres. I selected the middle bone, and first I went to weight paint mode to check the weight, and then I went to edit mode and set the weight to 0. And then back to weight paint mode, I used the gradient tool and I chose a very low weight value. And of course, I had to repeat the process with the other mesh. And now the movement is way less severe in the head area. Then I duplicated these keyframes so the breathing animation lasted the entire timeline, and I spaced the keyframes a bit to create a more natural, less robotic animation. Then I wanted to animate the clover just a bit. I started by converting the curve into a mesh, and I added a bone to control the stem. After scaling and placing this bone, I extruded 2 more bones to control the leaves, and I subdivided this bone because I was planning to animate the stem, but I didn't end up doing it. After parenting the clover to the armature, first I set the weight to 0 and then I applied the mirror modifiers so I could assign a different value weight to each one. Otherwise the leaves will move at the same time like this. I assigned a pretty low weight value to each leaf, and I also set the weight for the stem, but I didn't end up using the stem animation, so this step was kinda useless. And finally my rig was ready to get animated. Since I rigged the clover, I had to parent it again to the empty, so everything moves along with the lily pads again. And to make the clover move along the breathing motion, I insert a location keyframe and I moved this bone to match the frog's breathing, and I duplicated the first keyframe to create a loop. I deleted the Z-axis keyframes since their values didn't change during the animation. And finally, I made sure the movement of the clover matched the breathing motion. So I selected both armatures. I locked the keyframes for the breathing animation and I copied the stem keyframes and I made sure the stem keyframes were in the same place as the breathing keyframes. And after spending some time overlapping the keyframes, as you can see, when the frog's middle bone gets scaled up, the stem's bone moves up a bit to match the breathing animation. Then I animated the lips to create a beating motion. I set a rotation keyframe for both bones, then I moved the lips up and set a keyframe, and afterwards I moved the lips down and set a keyframe. I deleted the keyframes that had the same values to keep my timeline a bit cleaner, and I copied all the keyframes and made sure the first and last keyframes matched to continue with this seamless loop animation. Then it was time to animate the limbs with a simple up and down movement. First, I apply the mirror modifier for these outline lines because later I'm gonna set the weight paint. Then I set a rotation keyframe for the legs and the arms bones. And a few frames later I rotated the bones and set a keyframe. Things are looking weird right now, but that's because I have yet to determine how much influence the arm bones will have on some parts of my model, and I wanna do that in weight paint mode. I copied the first keyframes to the end to create a seamless loop animation, and here it is. And now let's fix this weirdness. Let's start with the spheres. We set the sphere's weight paint earlier, but in relation to the middle bone, so now let's choose the arm bones instead. I want the arms to have zero influence from the arm bone. And let's repeat for the other sphere, and this time I need to pick the other arm bone. This still looks weird, and that's because there's some influence in this part I want to get rid of. So in edit mode, I selected all these faces and set the weight to 0 for both arm bones. And now it looks normal. Remember, we already set the weight paint for the grease pencil object a while ago. And now we need to fix the outline lines not following the animation properly. First, I tried setting the weight paint, hoping I could get a simple fix for this, but I had to try a more manual approach. I set the weight to 0 so the bones had no influence on the movement of the lines, and I used shape keys to move them instead. I added 2 shape keys and I moved the meshes in edit mode. Then I set a keyframe at the beginning and at the end, and in the same frame where the legs keyframe is, I set the shape key to 1. This took me a while to get it right. I even added another shape key to fix the more subtle movements of this line. And I had to come back to edit mode a few times until it looked fine. And after a while of working on it, here it is. Then I had to repeat the process with the arms lines. First, I set the weight to 0 for all the bones. I added 2 shape keys, I set the keyframes, and I changed the placement of the meshes in edit mode. Again, I went back and forward from edit mode to object mode, trying to match the movement of the line art with the arm animation. And after a few touch-ups, I even moved the grease pencil object up a bit so the cheeks were on top of the lines. I had to add 2 more shape keys to fix some problems. And after spending some time on this, here it is. Now for what I think is the star of the show, the animated water ripples. There's a more in-depth water ripples tutorial in case you'd like to learn what each node does, but let's sum the effect up. I started with a plane and I subdivided it so the effect looked smooth, and I also added a sphere at the center. Then I added another plane and another sphere as well, and I repeated the process until I had one subdivided plane and one sphere for each lily pad. I put each sphere in a different collection, and this will make sense once I show you my GeoNode setup. And I parented each plane and each sphere to their corresponding empty, so they moved along with the lily pads. Then I added a node tree with these nodes to each plane, and in the collection info node I chose the collection of the corresponding sphere. And in the store named attribute node, you need to write any word. I wrote animation. Then I made this shader for each one of the planes, and I wrote the same word in the attribute node. Now, in the image texture node of each plane, I had to add a ripple image, and to get those ripple images, I opened the reference image in an image editor software to copy the shape of each ripple. So I ended up with several white ripple images with a black background, and I chose a different image for each plane. And I set the blend mode to alpha blend so the black background became transparent. And then I arranged each plane so they didn't overlap and looked good in camera mode. And now we can create the ripple effect by setting keyframes for the phase offset in the wave texture node. To recreate this effect, remember that the values might change if the planes or the spheres are bigger or smaller than mine. I had to make sure the animation looked correctly, and here I have my animated ripple. I did the same for the other shaders, and I obviously chose different values and timing for each shader to get some variety. And for this big plane, I used a driver instead. For this big ripple, I also wanted a more flashy animation, so I also animated the scale so this ripple gets big and then disappears. Of course, it took me some time to figure out where to put each scale keyframe. You're just seeing the finished animation without the chaotic process behind it. And I paired that scale animation with a fading effect by adding a couple of keyframes for this color ramp node that controls the visibility of the shader. Again, this took me some time until I came up with the final result, and I decided to create this effect for the big ripple only, since it's the most visible one. Let's decompose all the effects I did for this big ripple. First, the ripple effect using a driver in the wave texture node. Second, animating the scale of the plane. And finally, adding a disappearing effect by animating this color ramp node. At this point, the only element that was missing to achieve the same look as the illustration was the lighting. Keep in mind that my shaders were all emissive materials, so light is not going to change them, but I still wanted to make some light beams. So first I added this big cube, and I gave it a volumetric material so my light will pop up. The higher the density, the brighter the lights will look. Inside this big cube, I have my entire scene, my camera, my meshes, and the lights. I added a pretty strong spotlight to the side, and I gave it a bit of a warm tone. To get the light beams, I added a plane, I added some loop cuts, and I deleted some faces so the light could pass through the holes. I moved some edges until the beam lights were where I wanted them to be. I basically made my own gobbo or cookie. And to avoid any light spilling, I extended the edges of the plane. And finally, to get the light and moving effect, first I created some location keyframes and I moved the spotlight slightly so the effect wasn't too notorious. Remember, my first and last keyframes are always the same to achieve the loop animation effect. And the second thing I did was animate this material. I added it to the plane to achieve a double light effect. I created a keyframe for the scale in the noise texture node, and here is my effect. And so the light goes through these shapes I created with the noise texture node. You need to connect the color socket of the color ramp node to the alpha socket of the principal BSDF and set the blend mode to alpha blend and the shadow mode to alpha clip. Looking at the illustration, I thought there were some light beams missing at the opposite corner, so I duplicated the spot and the plane, and I had to create new location keyframes for the spot, and I maintained the same animation for the texture noise node. And here we have the final lighting. Let's recap all the steps for the lighting. Creating the light beams, location keyframes, noise texture node animation, and adding a second light on the opposite side. At this point, I had managed to recreate my reference image and to make the scene come to life. But I wanted to go a bit further and add some extra elements and effects that were not in the original illustration. To create the fishes swimming across the frame, I started with the cube and I applied a subdivision modifier since I needed some more geometry. To get the overall rounded shape, I enabled proportional editing and I simply moved and scaled some vertices. And to make the fins and the tail, I selected some faces and extruded them. After adding a subdivision modifier to make the mesh look smoother, I needed to add some loop cuts to act as support loops. To create some visual balance, I decided to have two fishes swimming from opposite sides of the frame. So I duplicated my mesh and I made some changes to the duplicate so each fish looked a bit different. I selected some edges from the top fin and I pressed V to separate those edges, and that way creating a double fin. And to close both shapes, I used the fill command. I split the tail as well, but here I ended up deleting the tail after using the rip command because I didn't like how it was looking, and I ended up extruding and scaling the vertices to achieve the kind of shape I wanted. I also used the knife tool to add some more geometry, and after moving some vertices around, I decided to add some side fins as well. I started by beveling some edges and extruded them. And by moving and scaling the edges, I tried to model the fins. I didn't attempt to get some perfect looking fishes since, first, they weren't going to be too visible because they were going to be pretty far away from the camera, and second, this is not a realistic scene, but also in order to keep the simple, stylized look that the illustration already had, adding too many details would have made the fishes to stand out. To get the underwater effect, I duplicated this plane and I needed the top plane to be turquoise but a bit transparent, so the fishes get a bit of a bluish tint. I controlled the opacity of the effect with a mixed shader node. And for the bottom plane, the emission shader I already had was enough to match the illustration. To animate the fishes, I used the Don't Drag constraint. This will give me a floppy animation style without too much struggle. To set this constraint real quick, just select the last bone and the next one and press Ctrl-Shift-C. I repeated the process 2 times with the following bones. And for the inference, I set the values in descending order to get a wiggle movement. I parent the armature with automatic weights and the weight values seemed fine to me. The animation process was pretty straightforward. After drawing the trajectory I wanted the fish to make with auto key enabled, as you can see, I selected all the bones and I made a location and rotation keyframe, and then I just kept moving the mesh. The Don't Drag constraint can be a bit buggy sometimes, so if your model acts crazy when you try to visualize the animation, reset the position. I had to do this before rendering as well, and I also had to render the animation from start to finish, otherwise the armature will act out as well. Then I rotated one bone, moved a few frames forward and rotated the following bone. This was to get a more wiggle motion. And then I rotated the bones to the opposite side, moved a few frames forward and repeated with the other bone. And I repeated this along the entire animation. And finally, I deleted the keyframes that had the same values to avoid my timeline being too messy. And I had to do a couple of adjustments to the animation and tweak the placement of the keyframes. I wasn't trying to achieve a very realistic animation, so as long as the fishes seemed kind of good, I was gonna be content with the result. And here it was, my animation preview for fish number 1. For the second fish, I used the same constraint, but I chose slightly different influence values. For this one, I displayed the armature as bendy bones and changed the number of segments. And I animated the mesh using the same method, moving and rotating the bones to get a wiggly motion across the frame. But in this case, I started by moving and rotating the first bone only. And once I had the speed sorted out, I selected the other bones and rotated them a bit across the animation. I will rotate the middle bone, then the bottom bone, then the middle bone again, and after a while I had 2 fishes swimming across the pond. For the shader, I used a very simple setup to get some spots, and to add some shadows to the model, I added some ambient occlusion too. I used the inverted hull method to get the line art, and for the other fish, I chose different values so they didn't look the same, but I used the same nodes. My next object on the list were dragonflies flying across the frame. I started with a single vertex, I extruded it and added a skin and a subdivision modifier. To create the shape of the body, I started adding subdivisions and I moved and scaled some vertices until my mesh resembled a dragonfly. Remember that when using a skin modifier, to scale the mesh, you actually have to use the Ctrl-A shortcut and not the S shortcut to set the skin radius of the vertices. For the wings, I repeated the process with the skin modifier, but since I was having some issues getting the shape right, I used the annotation tool since it's easier to follow a visual help than to try to wing it without any reference. And after that, modeling the wings seemed like a piece of cake. I just had to scale each vertex to match my reference. Placing the origin at the tip of the wing was gonna make the animation process way easier. And of course, there's no need to model the other wing, a mirror modifier will do the work. I added a second pair of wings and after placing them, I realized that they were going to touch when I started animating them. So I applied the solidify modifier and I changed the shape of the wings a bit with proportional editing enabled. To control the animation, I parented all my meshes to an empty. This way, I will be able to control the entire model with one simple object. The animation was very simple. I just animated the empty from point A to point B, and then I animated the set location as well. I also added a noise modifier to the set location channel to emulate the way these insects fly. And to animate the wings, I moved both pairs up, insert a keyframe, moved them down, set another location keyframe, and I copied the first keyframe. And I offset one of the wings keyframes so both pairs didn't move at the same time. I added a cycles modifier so the wings move along the entire animation, and I also added a noise modifier to get a flutter effect. I wanted 2 dragonflies, and of course I had to change the placement of the keyframes and the values of the modifiers of the duplicate, so both insects didn't move at the same time. I chose the final timing and done. The shaders were very simple. I wanted the body to have some spots, and for the wings I added some transparency by setting the blend mode to alpha blend. Technically, at this point, my animation was already done. I did make some changes to some shades, and I set my color management to standard medium-low contrast, and I rendered my scene using Eevee, and I could have called it a day, but I had the idea of making a day-to-night transition effect. So first, I created a copy of my project file. This one is gonna be the day-to-night effect. So at this point, I had 2 blend files. The day scene I just rendered, and this new night scene project file I'm about to make. Later I'm gonna create another project file, but first let's go with this one. Since this is gonna be the night scene, I deleted the objects that were in the day scene, such as the dragonflies and the fishes. Since changing the light wasn't gonna affect my scene, because I used all the emissive shaders, to achieve the overall night bluish effect, I added a plane, placed it on top of every mesh, and I gave it a shader similar to the one I used for the top water plane, but I picked a darker blue for the emission node, and to make the effect even more noticeable, I lowered the value in the transparent node. For the transition effect, I decided it was gonna take 150 frames to go from day to night. In frame 150, I set a keyframe for the mixed shader and for the transparent node. And in frame 1, since this is gonna be the day to night animation, I took the mix shader to 1 and the value in the transparent node to 1 as well, and I set a keyframe for both nodes. And now I had the overall day to night transition, but I felt like there were some details missing to make the effect even more believable. So I also changed the strength value of the water bottom plane a bit, so it went from bright to a bit of a darker shade. Then I had to change the color of the grease pencil strokes, so again in frame 1 I set a keyframe for each material color, and in frame 150 I changed the colors to shades with a bit more blue in them and a bit darker in value. My lily pads seemed like they needed a hint of blue as well, so I added a hue saturation value node to each lily pad. I set a keyframe in frame 1, and in frame 150 I set the hue to blue and lowered the saturation a tiny bit as well and set a keyframe. And of course I repeated the process with the other lily pads. The night effect was coming along, but there was one final touch missing: changing the light beams. After setting my keyframes in frame 1, I went to frame 150 and I changed the warm color of each spotlight to a blue one, and I also cranked the strength to give the stylized moonlight vibe to the light beams. I repeated the process with the other spotlight, and my day-to-night animation was done. And finally, since I wanted this animation to be looped, I created a new project file and I inverted the order of these keyframes to create a night-to-day effect. And of course I had to invert the keyframes of all the other properties I used to create the night effect. And after all that work, I had my daylight animation, my day-to-night animation, and my night-to-day animation. And the animation could start over and everything looped seamlessly. The first element I wanted to create for the night animation was some fireflies appearing the moment the night fell. In the day-to-night animation project file, I started with a cube and I created a new geometry node group. I also added a couple of spheres and I put them in a new collection. The fireflies will orbit around these spheres. I dropped this collection onto my GeoNode group and I added a couple more nodes. To control the size of the fireflies, I added a UV sphere node and I smoothed the spheres with a set shade smooth node. Then I added a noise texture node and a couple of vector math nodes, and I plugged them to my top nodes. With these vector math nodes, I was able to separate the fireflies from the spheres and move them around the 3 axes. I chose my values for the vector math nodes. Then I chose the number of fireflies I wanted, and I reset the position of my cube. I set the keyframe for the density value, and a couple of frames before I set the density to 0 and added a keyframe. And now, as soon as the night hits, little by little the fireflies appear. To emulate the frenzied motion of the bugs, I animated the noise texture node using a driver. I chose a very high number so the fireflies move very slowly. The shader is very simple. I used a principled BSDF node and I changed the emission color to a green shade. To make the fireflies light intermittent, first I connected a color ramp node to my math node and I chose a dark color, a light color with a value of 0.5 and a white color with a value of 2. So now some fireflies are brighter than others. And to make a twinkling effect, I added a noise texture node and I used a driver to animate it. Then I had to animate the fireflies going away since this was gonna be a loop animation. So now the fireflies appear, stay for a while and disappear. I set my frame range, then I enabled bloom and I rendered the fireflies separately with a transparent background. The second element I wanted to create for my night scene so it didn't look so empty were some moths flying across the frog. To create the moths, I took a dragonfly and since the moths have a shorter body, I deleted the vertices and made a boxy looking body instead. I also changed the shape of the wings. The dragonfly's wings were too curvy and I needed a bigger and more simple shape. I deleted the other pair of wings and I set the 3D cursor at the center so later on I could animate them easily. I applied all the modifiers but the subdivision modifiers so I could join both meshes. Then I animated the wings using shape keys. First I moved both wings down. Then I moved my moth down on the z-axis and I set a keyframe for my shape key and I added a noise modifier. Then I duplicated my moth, put all of them in a new collection and made sure the noise modifier had different values for each one so they didn't move in unison. And I set the moth origin to the tip of my model. This will be important shortly when adding the particle system. Once I had my moths, I added 2 spheres. One is gonna be the particle emitter and the other one is gonna be the leader, aka the object the moths will follow. I added a Bezier curve to use as a reference and I animated my leader through that curve. And once I was done animating this sphere, I deleted the curve I used as a reference. Then my emitter needed a particle system. I chose the number of particles I wanted, and I wanted the moth to appear at the end of the animation. In order for my particles to follow the sphere, I needed to set my physics to voids. There are a few YouTube tutorials that go deep into what each setting does when making voids particles. I added 2 rules, follow leader and avoid collision. And I had to set my animated sphere as my leader. After trying different settings out, when the particles behaved the way I wanted, I set the moth collection as my instance collection. And if your particles are facing the wrong side, then you might need to change their origin at the tip of the model like I did earlier. I chose the size of the particles and I hid the moth collection, the emitter and the followed object in renders. And just like with the fireflies, I rendered the moth separately and I set my frame range from frame 1, even if the moth appeared at the end, so it was easier to layer the sequence later in the compositing stage. My shader was similar to the dragonflies material. I created a translucent shader for the wings and a spotted material for the body, and I did the compositing in DaVinci Resolve since it's a free video editing software. Like I said, I rendered my day scene, my day-to-night file, and my night-to-day animation in Eevee as a PNG sequence. And I rendered the fireflies and the moth separately, and I set the fireflies blend mode to screen so the bloom was visible. And I did a minor color adjustment to the moth footage, and then I gathered several sound effects to create a pond ambience, and my animation was done. And now you've seen my process. What is stopping you from taking a 2D image and making it come alive using 3D software? If you liked this video, you're probably gonna enjoy this one too, and as always, thanks for watching and see you in the next one. Bye!